The summer heat clung to Blue Ridge like a thick, invisible fog as Richard Nelson, the newly appointed police chief, stepped out of his car. The North Carolina town was quiet in the early morning, but the precinct buzzed with movement. Wearing a worn plaid shirt, faded jeans and scuffed sneakers, he blended seamlessly with the everyday hustle. That was the plan. Richard wanted to see the department as it truly was, without the polished welcome speeches or forced smiles. As a black man stepping into a precinct rumored to harbor deep-seated issues, he needed to understand the culture from within. Walking through the lot, he caught glimpses of officers exchanging jokes, their laughter echoing in the air. A few spared him passing glances, but no one gave him a second thought. His face was unfamiliar, and his presence went unquestioned. He had deliberately kept his arrival low-key, ensuring that his first encounter with his officers would be unfiltered. He adjusted his cap and pushed open the precinct's side door. The inside was a whirlwind of movement, phones ringing, files being shuffled, conversations overlapping. The fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over the desks, the walls lined with commendations and case notes. Richard moved slowly, taking in the interactions around him. Groups of officers clustered together, engaged in casual chatter, reviewing reports or sipping on lukewarm coffee. The air was thick with routine. As he passed the break room, a sudden hush fell over one corner of the room. He barely had time to react before something cold and wet hit his face. The room stiffened. Richard froze as a sneering officer, a white man with a cocky smirk, stepped back, having just spat in his face. A murmur of amusement flickered among a few onlookers, while others shifted uncomfortably. The officer chuckled, assuming he was just another man who didn't belong there, someone unworthy of respect. But the laughter faded as Richard wiped his face and straightened his posture. Silence spread like wildfire as realization dawned in slow, agonizing waves. The weight of what had just happened settled over the room like an impending storm. The new police chief had just witnessed his department's ugly truth firsthand, and the reckoning was about to begin. Richard stepped into the precinct, his heart steady despite the tension thick in the air. Officer Daniel's voice had been laced with arrogance, his actions dripping with cruelty. The laughter of his colleagues echoed behind him, but Richard refused to react. He had faced racism before. This was nothing new. Yet, the sting of humiliation clung to him like a shadow. With measured steps, he walked toward the main office, his mind already working through the next move. His presence here wasn't a mistake. He had a purpose. He wasn't some lost soul wandering where he didn't belong. The weight of history, of countless others who had been dismissed and degraded like this, pressed against his thoughts. The intercom buzzed overhead, summoning all personnel to the briefing room. Richard knew this was his moment. He wasn't going to let Officer Daniel's actions define him. He wiped the last trace of spit from his face, straightened his posture, and stepped forward. The real confrontation was yet to come. The air in the briefing room thickened, the weight of Richard's presence pressing down on every officer in the room. The laughter and smug expressions had vanished, replaced by stunned silence. Richard let the moment stretch, his gaze scanning the faces before him. Some showed shock, others discomfort. Few dared to meet his eyes. Officer Daniels, who had been so confident just moments ago, now stood frozen, his arrogance crumbling. Richard could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers curled slightly, as if grasping for control that had already slipped through his hands. Richard had endured racism his entire life, but today he wasn't here to endure. He was here to lead. The very men who had mocked him minutes ago were now under his command. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. Prejudice didn't vanish overnight, but standing at the podium, he felt the undeniable shift in power. He took a breath, steady, and measured. Then, with quiet authority, he spoke again. "This department is about to change." The tension in the room was suffocating, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Richard's words had shattered the illusion of invincibility that some officers carried, exposing the deep cracks beneath their arrogance. He could see it in their faces, the quiet discomfort, the shifting gazes, the realization that the unchecked culture of racism and disrespect had met its reckoning. Daniels, who had reveled in his morning display of power, now stood small in the wake of Richard's authority. His confidence had drained, leaving only the shell of a man who suddenly understood the consequences of his actions. Richard let the silence settle like a heavy fog before continuing, his voice unwavering. "Change isn't coming. It's already here. What happened this morning wasn't just an isolated moment. It was a reflection of something deeper, something that will no longer be ignored." The officers remained still, absorbing the message they could no longer dismiss. Richard knew that words alone wouldn't transform the department, but this was the first step. This was the moment the balance shifted. He took one last look across the room, locking eyes with Daniels before turning away. The message had been sent. The real work was just beginning. A heavy silence blanketed the room. The weight of Richard's words pressed down on every officer, leaving no room for excuses, no space for denial. Daniels stood stiff, his once smug confidence now reduced to nothing. His own actions had exposed him, not just to Richard, but to the entire department. Richard let his gaze sweep across the room, taking in the uneasy expressions of those who had once laughed at his humiliation. Their silence spoke volumes. They weren't just witnesses to a reprimand. They were being forced to confront the truth of the culture they had helped sustain. He turned back toward the podium, his voice steady, unwavering. "This precinct will not be a place where racism thrives in the shadows. It will not be a place where respect is optional. Effective immediately, there will be accountability, there will be change, and there will be no tolerance for anything less than integrity." A subtle shift rippled through the crowd, not just fear, but realization. Richard wasn't just another name on a leadership roster. He was here to dismantle the old ways, to rebuild something stronger. As he gave Captain Harris a slight nod, signaling the beginning of a new era, Richard knew this was just the start. The battle wasn't over, but the first step had been taken. Richard let out a slow breath, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. The weight of what had just happened settled over him, not as a burden, but as confirmation that he was exactly where he needed to be. The fight against racism and corruption within these walls had begun, and there was no turning back. Daniel's suspension sent a clear message. The silence in the briefing room, the hushed murmurs as officers filed out, it all signified a shift. Some would resist, clinging to the old ways. Others would reflect, questioning their own roles in a broken system. Change would be slow, messy, but inevitable. The ringing phone cut through his thoughts. He reached for it, pressing it to his ear. "Chief." Captain Harris's voice came through, steady but laced with something unreadable. Richard leaned back in his chair, gaze fixed on the precinct beyond his office door. "This is just the beginning," he murmured. "Let's get to work." The shift in the precinct was undeniable. The same officers who had once found amusement in Daniel's cruelty now walked with caution, their laughter subdued, their conversations more measured. Richard's presence was no longer just that of a new chief. It was a force of accountability, a reminder that the old ways were dying. He kept his routine steady, moving through the halls with purpose, making sure his presence was felt. The silence that followed in his wake wasn't fear. It was awareness. Some officers, like Reyes, saw the change as an opportunity. Others saw it as a threat. When Reyes admitted her past silence, Richard met her gaze with unwavering steadiness. "It starts with you," he had told her, because he knew that real change wasn't about orders. It was about choice. But not everyone was ready to choose the right path. Resistance lingered in the shadows, in the hardened stares, in the way some officers avoided his eye. The toxic roots of racism didn't vanish overnight. Richard knew the battle was far from over, and he was ready for it. Daniel's appeal was nothing more than a desperate attempt to escape accountability. But Richard had no intention of backing down. The investigation into Daniel's past revealed exactly what he had expected: a pattern of unchecked behavior, allowed to thrive under a system that had looked the other way for too long. His appeal was denied, sending a message that the old rules no longer applied. Yet Richard knew change wasn't just about removing bad officers. It was about reshaping the mindset of those who remained. Some embraced the shift, recognizing their own biases and striving to do better. Others resisted, unwilling to let go of the past. But every step forward, no matter how small, mattered. At a community event, Richard saw firsthand the scars left by years of mistrust. The young boy's hesitant words echoed the feelings of so many who had been failed by the system. Richard met his gaze with steady warmth, offering not just words, but a promise, one he fully intended to keep. Because this fight wasn't about power or position. It was about proving, one action at a time, that real change was possible. And Richard wasn't going anywhere. Richard watched the precinct slowly transform, not through grand gestures, but through steady, unwavering commitment. The toxic culture that once thrived in the shadows had been forced into the light. Some officers had chosen to change, others had chosen to leave. Either way, the message had been clear. There was no place for racism here. The community, once distant and distrustful, had begun to take cautious steps forward. It wasn't perfect, it never would be. But trust, once broken, was being rebuilt one action at a time. As he stood in the hallway that evening, watching officers interact with a newfound sense of respect, he allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. Laughter still filled the air, but now it carried a different weight, not exclusion, but unity. The road ahead would always be difficult, but Richard had never expected anything less. Change wasn't easy, it wasn't quick. But looking around, he knew one thing for certain: it was worth it.